in the Calvary Bible Church. The one and only Graham Parker and Jesse Miller.
Wow.
That was good.
Alrighty then.
Who was that?
So that was Andrew Johnson, our most loyal listener.
Our supported missionary and loyal listener.
Part of the thing with us taking him on for support was he had to listen to every episode of the Calvary Cast. And so he did.
And he came up with this new intro for us right now because he thinks we should have
a distinct recorded intro every time, and so he sent me one, not knowing that I would use it. So it'll be a little bit of a surprise for him when he cues up this latest episode of the podcast. But this is episode 71, and this is also introducing a new feature for our VIP listeners. You can become a Calvary Cast Plus subscriber, and you can have the honor of getting your intro at the beginning of the podcast.
How do they become a Plus subscriber?
Just listen to the podcast.
Oh, usually they got to pay for something like that, and then they would get like more content.
Yes, that's true. Well, they can pay, and no more content, and you could still be considered. You just be a Plus subscriber. So you have to actually have listeners and have content that people want to pay for in order to pay more for it. And
are you implying that we don't have listeners and that we don't have content people would pay for?
Yes. Yes.
You're
and
not
the data and the stats.
You're just saying
the data and the stats would back it up. So, but if people want to send us an intro like Andrew did, preferably don't record it in your car
because we will use it.
We will use it, and so yeah.
Good.
That's all I have for the intro there.
That's our intro.
Oh, except that last time we didn't talk. We're past 70 episodes now.
So, yeah, and we said, didn't we say after last time, we got to make a big deal about 75th?
Yes.
It might be like a highlights.
Maybe we just do something funny for the whole episode. Or funny to us. We could laugh and do things.
Yeah,
I don't know.
I don't know. We'll think of something.
Maybe we'll just have cake. We
could just sit here and eat cake, and they would just listen to us eating and drinking. We wouldn't even say anything. Our family is so weird about this. Whenever we're sitting down to eat, we have to put music on because we can't stand listening to each other eat. It drives us nuts. Oh, it is. It's become a weird thing. It never used to be that way, but now we'll sit down to eat, and it'll be like, Alexa, play dinner music or whatever, because we don't like to hear each other.
Well, we like to have dinner or music on sometimes, but not because of the sound of the other person. What are you guys, like slobs?
Hey, is that a recording of our dinner time? That's exactly.
Shut up, Wyatt!
That's exactly what we do.
Oh my word! Yeah, no. Our dinner, we maybe that's what we do. We just don't know it because our dinners are allowed because of our young children. It's usually Cohen, sit down, eat your food. Cohen, sit down, eat your food.
Over and over.
Stay at the table. Don't get out. Yeah.
You don't have to make him eat. That boy gets hungry enough, he'll eat. I remember
all
when
he would eat is meat. He wouldn't eat what he want. Yeah.
I remember when Jace was just an infant, and I'm talking like just born or whatever. And when we were visiting him, and he would be crying because he's hungry. And I'd go, you don't need to he wouldn't take his bottle or something. I don't remember what it was. And I said, that boy's hungry enough. He'll eat. He can get that bottle for himself. Just being kind of like, he's this little helpless infant. Anyway, that's where that came from with Cohen,
Yeah, right, yeah. No, I mean, yeah, well, he would just eat like carbs and meat all day and things like that. So, yeah. Anyway, that's not what we're talking about today. We are not talking about eating loudly at the table.
Nope.
We're talking about, we're kind of in a pattern of talking about the book of the month, which Jess is holding up in his Vanna White way. Too bad we need to have this on camera and people could see you modeling the book.
I told you we need to start videoing this, and then I think it would probably add a lot, and people would probably watch it.
I don't think it would add anything. It'd probably make it worse. We'd lose viewers.
We'd be more conscious
listeners.
of people watching and listening, so that there'd be, I don't know, I think maybe we would feel more dynamic.
I'd have to put pants on then.
Yeah, that's true. So would I.
We both have pants on, just in case. But anyway, we are talking about our book of the month for last month. We've decided at the end of the month, we'll do a podcast on the book of the month, which is not actually our plan. That's just the way it worked out. But that book that we had for January was Ed Welch's book, Depression, Looking Up from the Stubborn Darkness. And we think this is a great book that who should read this, I guess? Everyone?
I think it's good for people who battle with depression or people helping people battling depression or trying, like let's say a relative of yours or a friend or something. And he does a good job at helping you kind of understand where it's coming from, but also giving you a direction and helping that person. So people that are battling with depression will find it useful.
Yep.
Or if you have in the past and you're thinking you may in the future type of thing. And then people that are helping others.
Yeah.
So Ed Welch is a licensed psychologist and faculty member at the Christian Counseling Educational Foundation.
CCEF.
And he's been counseling for many years. He's written a number of books as kind of a fruit of his biblical counseling. And the reason I like Ed Welch, a number of reasons I like him, but one of the reasons I like recommending him is because he's got street cred, because his degree is from a secular university, right? He's up to PhD level.
Right.
So he knows
the
what they're
secular
saying.
approach,
Yeah, and he knows the secular approach. He's educated in it, and he I wouldn't say that he doesn't draw from that. I mean, if you read the book, he draws on that experience, knowledge, and yet shows why biblical counseling
analyzes it from a biblical perspective.
Yeah, and biblical counseling being the direction he goes. The
means of change, or the means that he would apply to a person dealing with these issues is not going to be a secular one. It's going to be a biblical counseling based one.
Right.
Yeah.
And so in a book like this is important with depression, because depression is such a common type of suffering, even among Christian people. And statistically, the data is showing it's increasingly so in the age in which we live. Yeah. And there are probably a number of reasons for that. Yeah. But yet, so if you read this, you'll see we don't go through the contents of the book too much. I got a couple things that I was just going to draw out, and we were going to talk about that. But I do recommend it. And I've had a couple of people already talk to me about it and are enjoying it or have enjoyed it as they read through it.
I think that with all those things that you said about him, his writing style is really good, for one. I think he's a good writer. But he is just so thoughtful. I appreciate how he applies the scriptures to the issues of life. And it's not in a, one of the charges or tropes against biblical counseling is the old adage, take 3 Proverbs and call me in a week or something like that. That's kind of the way people view biblical counseling. And you read somebody like Ed Welch, and it is not that. It's not simplistic. It's not reductionistic. It's really helpfully, thoughtfully applying the scriptures to the issues of life. And I think he does that very well.
And I think if you do research on what is truly biblical counseling, you will find a lot of criticism about it. And largely that criticism will be taking quotations from kind of like would we consider him the father of modern biblical counseling would be Jay Adams. Yeah. And if you put and that was I was exposed to Jay Adams in seminary when I took the class biblical counseling. That was our text, right? So if you took that book and laid it down and read through it, and then you took this one, you're going to have a different vibe and feel as though biblical counseling has kind of come a long way. And it's, like you said, there's it seems to be more sympathetic or empathetic or whatever term we would want to use.
A little softer or something.
Softer and patient in understanding that not every problem is directly solved by, that's your problem, here's a verse for that. Just memorize this verse and then do it because it seems to me that, this type of biblical counseling has taken things further and understood that we're very complicated as human beings. And the fall has only further complicated that. So any kind of counseling is going to take patience and time, and so it's just different.
It's
a different
matured.
vibe.
I think it's the
matured.
way that I would describe it. It's matured so much from those early years of it. So,
Right.
All that was for free. That we didn't really plan to just discuss biblical counseling, but I think you have to kind of set that context when this is a biblical counseling approach to depression that we're advocating and that we would seek to practice ourselves. So, talk about the book for a little bit.
Sure.
What things stood out to you? What was some of the most helpful things?
Yeah, I think the best thing about when in the beginning, what he does is he addresses the fact that in our culture, our kind of the default mode of anybody suffering with an emotional trial.
Sure.
So let's say emotional suffering like depression or anxiety. There is this tendency in our culture now to immediately default all those things, all those feelings, to mental illness or a medical issue, a chemical imbalance. This can be treated with medicine, those kind. And he kind of begins and launches off the book with addressing that, saying that is not the wisest route to go, right? He talks about this specifically in relation to depression. Many people, you hear them talk about depression in the sense of chemical imbalance. And the more, if you look into that concept of the chemical imbalance, you quickly find that even psychiatrists are not agreed on this, and it is a theory, right? He says no one can confidently diagnose a chemical imbalance because there is no way to really know. Even if there were a test for it, which there isn't, the test couldn't tell you if the imbalance caused the depression or resulted from it. He goes on to say, the problem with immediately opting for a medical explanation is that once the decision is made, every other perspective seems superficial or irrelevant. Okay? And that's important because what he's saying is there can be other reasons, and probably are, for why a person is battling depression. And if our immediate go-to default is chemical imbalance, not only am I finding just in my own just very surface level research that that's unscientific in and of itself, because again, the chemical balance, the serotonin imbalance is just a theory they can't prove or demonstrate, right? So, but if we immediately default to my soul issues right now of depression are attributed to some medical diagnosis or a chemical imbalance, then I'm not going to be searching for really other answers of why this could be happening, and never connecting it then to any kind of spiritual element in it. Right? Does that make sense?
Yeah. And I think that he's trying, really in this book, he's avoiding a simplistic or reductionistic approach to how we view the causes of depression, right? And right from the offset, like we kind of are jumping into the medical side, and this is going to bring up the medication question. And he doesn't say a person shouldn't take medication. He just says, don't make that your first resort. And there's a whole host of things that could be contributors to your depression. And even more than that, and I think this is the thing that stood out to me most, is that depression is a form of suffering. And so when we understand that, and you mentioned this on Sunday, when we understand that depression is a form of suffering, then we really can view what the Bible teaches about suffering as applying to our depression.
Right.
Just like we would view any other medical you're dealing with cancer or something like that, that's a form of suffering, and there's a biblical response we all understand.
Right.
So the same thing should happen with our depression as well.
And I think if we think about depression, well, in the context of suffering, the Bible gives very specific instructions.
Yes.
Now all of a sudden your depression can take on a new joy-producing meaning.
Yes.
So God in all our suffering has good intentions for us to become like Christ.
Yep.
But also, if we're always thinking of depression and anxiety, and I'm mentioning those two because they're the biggest ones that people deal with. If we're thinking of that emotional type of suffering always in the context of mental illness, right? I think that is misconveying those emotions when, as we mentioned Sunday, we see Jesus experiencing them. Here was a man who was a man of sorrows. That's how he was described, and acquainted with grief. And I thought about this. If you're the perfect man living in a sin-ruined world, the proper emotional response is often going to be sorrow or depression. In other words, it isn't a mental illness. It may mean that your chemicals in your brain are responding exactly the way they're supposed to.
Yeah.
And this is just the natural response in a fallen world is to sometimes experience sorrow, maybe even sometimes depression. Now, I say that with caution because there are dangerous levels of depression.
Yes.
If they're not responded to right, and so I don't want to diminish very serious levels of depression and how we can respond to some of those. But I'm just saying that not all depression is mental illness, and not all anxiety is mental illness, or negative emotional feelings are something Jesus experienced as the perfect man in a fallen world. And so attributing it all to that then won't allow us to really dig in and maybe find reasons that are causing our issues.
Yeah.
And I'm going to give you an example because I listened to a podcast yesterday it was, and when I was working out, and I was listening to, and I've never listened to this podcast before, but I was browsing the podcast and the title caught my attention. Yeah. So there was an interview with this professor, and I think she was out of Stanford maybe or something. But anyway, and she wrote a book about, what's it called? Not serotonin, but what's the dopamine in your brain, and the connection between dopamine and addiction. And she relates so basically the way she described it, and I'm not an expert on this. I have a podcast expertise in it now, but that's about it, right? So she simplified it for dummies, but basically, you have these neurotransmitters in your brain, and there's pleasure and pain responses, right?
Yes.
And she said they work together kind of like a balancing system. So like if you are experiencing dopamine in the brain, the brain has a way of like balancing that out, and there's also pain or discomfort that needs to balance out, and it keeps it balanced, right? Sure. The problem is that if you indulge in an activity over and over and again that produces this dopamine, that your body on the one hand needs more and more of it to produce that dopamine. You're going after that, right? And then when you're not having it, the body overreacts with these negative chemicals or however that works, right? And that's why you kind of fwill bummed or irritable or even depressed. And depending on what it is that you're becoming addicted to, it will determine the severity of that.
Interesting.
So she tells her story of getting hooked on romance novels.
Wow.
Now, you and I don't understand that, but I'm sure a lot of people might say, well, I do, because there are people that that get so involved in these romance novels, and then they're hoarding them, and now with Kindle, it's only amplified because you can get them for like 99 cents, and I guess they describe how they get done with one and they need the next one, and so they get another one and they read that, and how it grew into like, going from just the romance novels to like 50 Shades of Grey or one of those, right? And it just becomes this addiction cycle. So anyway, the reason I say, and then she was talking about the fact that some people have these addictions, they don't even realize it's happened. And it could be with things like social media, or video games are big. She works with people with that. All these type of things that produce this dopamine. Yeah. The reason I'm bringing this out is, let's just consider the possibility that if you're depressed, that this is just one example. Yeah. Okay. As we're digging, as we're probing, as we're talking about depression, we're talking about habits in your life. Yep. All of a sudden it surfaces that like you are a chronic binger of whatever it is. Romance novels or whatever you thought was harmless. I mean, there's no verse in the Bible that talks about romance novels or whatever. But there could be things like that have become idolatrous to you.
Yes.
And if you would take away those things or at least get a handle on them, then it would help you feel better, right?
Yeah. Or you're going to, if that's taken away, you're going to feel depressed for a time.
Right. And I just thought that was interesting because as I was thinking about it, we don't attribute everything to medical issues, but the brain is active in all of our issues.
Organ.
And so we got to think through all those things. But if we just attribute it to, well, you have a chemical imbalance, because here's the thing, and I found this out, I was like, what? Because they don't know if they don't have a test for chemical imbalance.
Right.
If they did, they wouldn't be able to tell you if the chemical imbalance is causing the depression or the depression is causing the chemical imbalance. That's important.
That is, yes.
Because you may be doing something or thinking something that is actually causing the chemical imbalance, if there were one, or whatever it is. So again, we don't want, I think what a lot of times people have charged biblical counseling with these simplistic, reductionistic answers to these problems, and actually the way it's maturing, it's getting deeper, and it's reacting against the simplistic, reductionistic answers of the culture.
Right. Because in many ways, I don't know, I think you maybe mentioned this earlier, it's almost easier to sometimes just come to a conclusion of a medical thing, and there's a simpler answer. Take this pill and it's all good. And again, like, we both know and have people in our lives that have been helped by medicine. And like Ed Welch brings it out, he says, and that happens. And why that happens, we don't always understand why it works for one person and why it doesn't work for another. We don't know. That's just where the science is at on that. And he makes this point, if I can find the I shouldn't be looking up. I should have had it marked where I was going to look. The point is that the medical treatment is not our hope, right? He says a medical treatment can change the experience of depression, not because it is a successful treatment in itself, but because we have put our hope in the treatment, and our hope is what revises our experience of depression. So sometimes your hope can be misplaced, right? You think, if I just go to this counselor or this take this pill or whatever, all my problems will go away, and maybe for a time, but ultimately it's not going to produce the kind of change, and you may miss out on the lessons the Lord would want us to learn through that kind of suffering, the refining and purifying processes he brings us through.
And we don't want to forget that. We always want to circle back to the fact that it's a form of suffering that we want immediately. We want immediate relief, but God doesn't always do that with any kind of suffering.
Yep.
And because he has a purpose in it.
Yeah.
Now, again, if the suffering is very severe, if the depression is so severe, people are thinking of suicide, they have those constant morbid thoughts, they're in deep despair, then you know what? I don't have nobody should really have a problem with them taking medication to, as Ed Welch says, can take for some, it can take that edge off.
Right.
But there should be more than that in this, would we say, self-analyzation and counseling and talking about things and trying to then figure out what are some of these core issues. Maybe it was 100% something wrong with the brain. Okay. But it certainly isn't going to hurt you to explore other spiritual options and that. And
he brings out here too, even any kind of form of suffering is going to be, we're going to be asking questions about the goodness of God, about why I'm going through these things. So again, even if it's 100%, medical, there's still a spiritual response to it. Just as we would say with cancer or any other kind of form of physical suffering, there's a spiritual response that's going to help you walk through that trial with joy. And see the Lord's purposes in it. And so, again, we don't want to miss those opportunities for spiritual growth and sanctification and change. Maybe
John Piper should write a book called "Don't Waste Your Suffering," or no, don't waste
your cancer.
No, he wrote that. What am I thinking? Don't waste your depression. Don't waste your depression.
That's a book he should write.
Maybe he should write that.
Maybe he should.
So I think that's why I think this book is helpful. I think people will find it helpful. In either, if they battle depression or helping others that battle depression. And then part of our the way we do things as we recommend books, we're always thinking that maybe in some of these instances, the author has written other things that might be helpful. And in this case, I think that's the case, especially his book on addictions. It's very well known.
His book on anxiety is really good.
Right.
We actually recommended another book of his probably a year ago, the Side by Side, which is just about learning to basically do the basics of biblical counseling. How do you apply the gospel to one another's lives?
Right.
So yeah, I've read several of his books, and they're all excellent.
Yeah.
Do we want to talk for just a second about how we would approach counseling somebody with depression?
Sure.
So what do you think?
Well, again, like anything like this isn't going to be a one-size-fits-all, right? We got to just, like with anything, if somebody's struggling with something like this, let's get together and talk.
Yeah.
So pretty much we want to listen to how they're feeling, what they're walking through at the time, and just describing why we're talking.
Yes. Yeah, I think that there's, and the reason I ask this is because I hope that people here in this podcast, like we want to have a heart for people that are suffering this way, and by God's grace, try and apply the Word of God to their hearts in life. And we're not perfect in this by any means, but if we can help people in our own church in this regard, we want to do that.
Right.
So this would be kind of maybe a general approach, but yeah, we start with talking and asking a lot of questions when these feelings begin, and trying to evaluate maybe were changes that came upon you. You're trying to just connect some dots,
right,
so to speak, as when that happened. And I think another thing that's really important in any biblical counseling as a Christian, and as we think about the reality that this is a form of suffering, we always will go back to the hope of the gospel and the hope for change and the grace that God gives to walk through suffering, even if the feelings of depression were never to go away,
right,
you can still glorify God in that.
Yeah. And I think that's always reminding people with these kind of issues is that there's no quick fix.
Right.
The world doesn't have it either. So
Right.
if you're thinking, well, if I go to somebody either outside the church or a non-biblical counselor, they have the answers out there.
Right.
That is just simply not true.
No.
And I think if you do a little research, you're going to find that even those that do what we call the integrationist counseling, and they're trying to use the Bible and they use psychology and different things. But the reality is they don't have the answers.
Right.
But we have to believe that God does.
Right.
And that he loves us,
Yep.
and that he's put into his word helpful commands, things to think about, direction to go, and that his Spirit you have to have faith that God can help you
Right.
either out of it or through it.
Yep.
Or through it and then out of it. So we're putting our faith in God and not medicine or a form of counseling or a particular counselor. And so as we're probing, we're looking at these things, and sometimes depression counseling could take different directions.
Yes.
You something might open up that, we need to trace that.
Yep.
And I think a lot of times with any kind of counseling like this, there's nothing wrong with let's try this approach right now.
Yep.
Here's what I want you to do this week.
Right.
And he brought out one thing and I thought was great, and I'll leave it with this, but he talked about all people that battle with depression should become experts in joy. So not that you're feeling joy, but you become a biblical expert in joy. And he goes, you have nothing to lose in this.
Yeah.
And, the worst that could happen is you just see joy all over the scriptures, even if you're not feeling it yet. Something like that.
Yeah.
Let's talk about biblical joy. Let's look at examples of that. Let's look in the Bible at examples of depressed people, maybe both in story narratives or also in the Psalms.
Yeah, the Psalms are full of that language.
Let's look at Jesus and depression. Let's look at and always getting the person to look at God, because our hope is in him.
Right.
So there's different avenues, not like do this and then do that and then do this and that's the answer.
Right.
Let's trust the Spirit to lead us in the direction we need to head to help you either endure endure and then out of
Yes.
it, or out of it,
Yep.
right?
And there's, practical things like even reading this book would be a helpful thing for somebody walking through depression. And so we say that because we do trust in the sufficiency of God's word and for dealing with the issues of life. And so depression is one of those. And there is hope and help found there.
That's right.
Anything else?
I don't think so.
All right. Well, we hope this podcast has been helpful for you as you think about issues of life and even things like depression. We love to hear from our listeners. You can email us at thecalvarycast@gmail.com if you want to be a Calvary Cast Plus subscriber by listening and send us an introduction to the podcast. Send it to our email. Or you can call us or text us or talk to us on a Sunday morning if you're a part of our church. The Calvary Cast is a production of Calvary Bible Church in Grand Junction, Colorado, where we exist for the glory of God, the good of his people, and the Great Commission. Until next time.